Green Park, and I am a dancer, both trained and a social dancer. And I feel like it's important to mark the difference. And a collaborator, and I could be described as an activist or an advocate, I think, at times. Generally, I like to gather people around questions and probably have quite a dark sense of humour, but I'm quite playful as well. So that presents in a range of roles: performer, choreographer, movement director, wannabe intimacy coordinator, and sometimes just a prodder and a provoker, turning up to advocacy spaces and sometimes putting my foot in my mouth and asking awkward questions.
Yeah, don't you have to do like a training for intimacy coordination? I read about it.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I think when you work, you would find it really interesting and really valuable, because it leans into, I think, a lot of the questions we're going to talk about. And there's now a certification process with that, but that is largely based around making spaces to have conversations about the rigor involved. So that it's on the to-do list. Unfortunately, not possible to do the training in current circumstances.
Wow, you've got so much under your belt. I'm just going to say I'm a choreographer based in Edinburgh. My name's Roberta Jean. I'm a choreographer based in Edinburgh, in response to that question.
I don't know about you, but I find that interesting though, because I have so much respect for you and the work you make, in the sense that you are a choreographer and that's what you do. And I sometimes struggle to grasp that one thing and think that's where I'm going. I think I'm just messier than that.
Yeah, there's some stuff going on. I actually sing for myself for a little bit. I do singing for advertisements and fashion. So getting a little bit of income through that during this period has been quite helpful. But yeah, in the main, I guess I profile myself as a choreographer. So yeah.
Do you find that, can I ask, do you find that helpful to profile yourself as a choreographer and have that clarity around that?
Yeah, I mean, it involves a lot of different jobs, as you know, in terms of negotiating the sector, fundraising, looking after people. But yeah, I guess I profile myself in quite simple ways. My work has been directly and indirectly informed by my experience with having a chronic illness, which affects mental health. So I have something called premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and it affects mental health. It's a biological illness that I share with my sister, and it's made me quite psychologically curious. And this has kind of filtered into my practice to date. And at the moment, I'm developing new work looking at neuroscience and psychology, exploring neuroscience and psychology. Yeah, so it's kind of fed into kind of naturally, and now it's kind of becoming more of a direct focus, for sure. Yeah, it's quite scary to kind of say it out loud. I kind of kept things under wraps before 2020, and then there kind of this period turned up where people started to be more open about things and started to divulge more things. Still quite scary to kind of divulge mental health illness in the dance sector, I think. Yeah. How about you?
I would totally agree. I think there's even sitting here, and I think I'd try and in my head, I believe in transparency, and I believe in a world where if people are comfortable, they share the way they live. But I still have that reticence, and I can feel it bubbling in me now.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I really see that in you and that recognize that. And I think I'm with you on the fact that with chronic illness, I think that becomes more complex. And when that chronic illness is woven in to other things, I think it becomes more complex because in a sector that is under resourced, where everything is about just time and move quickly, it's too overfacing for people to often deal with all of that. And by deal with, I don't mean like have to understand it, but I mean just accept it and make space for adjustment. So I didn't know that mental health was a major part of my work until about 5 years ago. But the first piece I ever made and toured was explicitly about mental health and living with someone who had very severe symptoms in terms of bipolar disorder.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was easier. And then I've been through a string of works that I hadn't realised were totally asking loads of questions about mental health. And in that process, have finally got enough support to realise that I live with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I recently was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and those two things go hand in hand. So again, there's that biological, psychological thing
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That I think is really complicated when, as a dancer, for me anyway, as a dancer, I used to find a lot of my identity in trusting my body. And then suddenly being like, I don't know if I can totally trust my body anymore all of the time. And I think that bleeds into the work actually, and can bleed in to the uncertainty of the work and chipping away at the stereotypes of what dance can be and the situations we have to work in around dance. That's a very floaty way of saying lots of things that are kind of in my brain, but I haven't totally articulated them yet to myself.
I think artists are really good at articulating or expressing kind of complexity and the difficulties of being human. And yet I think that the old kind of school idea persists within the dance sector, whereby certainly on main stages, it's kind of the survival of the strongest and the fittest mentally and physically. And I'm not sure how useful an idea that is when it comes to the process of art making. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. And that I have loads of questions about what the boundary of the dance sector is and what, because it's actually such a huge question of when it starts. Like, do you start being part of the sector if you're someone who went to dance class when you were 3? Is that when that mentality starts? Is it in training? Is it in rehearsal rooms? Is it on stages? Is it on tour, sitting on the train? Like where, because I think for me, that's where everything relates to mental health, and not in a wishy-washy sense, but all of those, it can be lots of tiny factors that can actually be the dangerous nudge over the edge. And we tread this really delicate ground of being vulnerable and asking people to be vulnerable with us and very open, and then having to work with that within a certain amount of time pressure. And I think I have loads of questions around what that means in terms of like process and repetition when things are a bit of a meritocracy and there's a little bit of like a production line going on, or that can be a way to survive the sector, that there's not much space to become cyclical. And that's where a lot of my research about mental health sits, in this notion of just recognizing patterns and recognizing that things are cyclical, whether that be in my own body in terms of monitoring my health and the things that can disrupt that health, or the fact that some creative process. David Gordon once said, and I thought this was beautiful, that he's made 75 pieces in his life, but he's actually only made 3, and piece number 74 was version 20 of piece 3. And I just thought that's really beautiful, and it makes me think of visual art and the notion that there's that like process of repetition can really be embedded into everything, and sketching and sketching and sketching and sketching to find. And I wonder how the dance sector relates to that, and how we find ways to make those spaces where that kind of inquiry can happen. So the vulnerability happens in a space that can be cyclical before we present those things. Yeah, and there's a few collective models, I think, interesting, like collective models of working that are becoming more visible, that seem to be based in mutual aid, that I think are really interesting models to look to, and I would hope are the future of the sector, that create that space for all of the difference and all of the different paces to come together.
Wow.
Sorry for, it all comes out.
Yeah, you should do, I don't know, some paid research with this, or yeah.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
It's, I think, time to think, which I don't know in terms of the sector for you, how that time for me is a big question, and it maybe will naturally lead into our next question that's there, but how you manage the timescales and those cycles, and working as an artist in a sector that sometimes demands quite speedy working.
I think things are shifting. So I guess I've kind of grown up, and you have as well, in a kind of Dragon's Den style kind of pitching, kind of proposal pitching climate. And I think that's kind of disappearing a little bit more. And yeah, I feel like it would be useful to have kind of more, and I think it's happening to an extent, and certainly this kind of period of pause and reflection is kind of creating the space to kind of shift, for sure. But if there are kind of more routes into practice or into commissioning, I think it's kind of healthier for kind of everyone. Yeah, I mean, I've certainly had experiences where I've just found that kind of pitching process, where you're kind of given a very short amount of time to kind of get your idea across. I've found that kind of very stressful from a mental health perspective. Yeah, it would be great to kind of see more ways of kind of managing these kind of processes.
I find this a really tricky question, because I don't know that I've ever stopped. I think I've been forced to stop, but I don't know that I've ever chosen to stop. So I'm not sure I can answer it with honesty, other than I think I have a lot of fear. There's something really attractive about stopping, and I think I've been thinking a lot lately about what it is to be fallow, and that kind of like agricultural thinking, and what it is to rest as nourishment. But I think there's also something in me that goes, stopping means having to restart again, and actually that everything moves so quickly that you can be lost in that shift. And I wrestle with that, because I don't believe I believe in capitalism, but I know in that I absolutely buy into it and that my body is buying into it. And that's a really like visceral feeling of fear, genuine fear about never being able to start again. How does it work for you?
So Previously, I've taken like gaps in practice, but I've always kept it secret. And although it is kind of useful to take that break, to try to kind of implement some self-care, some certainly for me personally, kind of management of illness. I felt, because of kind of the pressures of the industry, that I couldn't really let on to people that employ me that I took that kind of stopgap. I found it really hard to stop in March last year, and yeah, I think a lot of people felt the same in terms of kind of getting momentum on certain projects and so on. But yeah, there have been like, you know, positives to kind of going through that experience as well. Yeah, but I agree with you, you know, fallow periods can be incredibly useful, and it's so difficult to kind of plan that into a freelance situation though, because of how it affects your bank balance and so on. But yeah.
I have an interest, I'm curious as well about where scarcity comes into this. And I say that because I've been reading loads about the psychology of scarcity lately, that it sounds really silly, but it's really obvious. But it's one of those proper black swan moments where as soon as you read it, you're like, that's dead obvious, but it wasn't. It wasn't in my brain. And the notion, the basic premise is that in any form of scarcity, the behavior pattern will repeat the same. So if you're time scarce or money scarce or whatever, and the notion to say yes and kind of throw yourself forward into things more. And I struggle with that in terms of stopping, because I think there is also a class thing that's wound up in that, where having not had any connection to the arts at all, there's a real fear of not understanding what's happening and recognizing, and only in recent years have I put my finger on this, that there is like cultural capital or social capital that exists as a way to survive. So by being visible or being invited into spaces. And I sometimes think that my instinct, I think I'm someone that responds to stress quite actively. I'm an all or nothing person. I like a festival. I want to go and I want to be out of control for the weekend. And then I'm going to have a slump and rest that off. And that, I think that's how I've always been, and that's how I'm wired. So that like adrenaline rush is helpful. But in situations like the pandemic, it results in like stepping forward to fight fires. And then that is positively rewarded. So there's something in me that goes, oh, so like keep stepping forward, find that. And I find it hard to recognize the stop point in that and being like, that's not a practice. That isn't a choice. That isn't any of those things. It's a really dangerous pattern to be in. And I wonder how we stop rewarding that in a way, or that we try and build systems that are more resilient so that that doesn't become something that's rewarded as a way to, for me, as a way to deflect. I think that's what I'm scared to stop, because then I have to sit with the art and the art making and the difficulty of that. Whereas if I'm fighting fires somewhere else, I feel a bit alive because I'm still in rooms with people. And I think that's really complicated actually, because like, where does the identity go if you stop?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to kind of try to cultivate some kind of happiness away from work as well. We get kind of so caught up in our work in relationship to our self-worth, and that can be quite tricky, especially if you're someone that has mental health stuff going on. That can be a little bit dangerous even. Yeah, so to try to kind of create space from work is kind of certainly really, really vital for me. Yeah, but it's not quite accepted and it's not supported, and I think the idea of sabbatical within kind of freelance contexts or is not supported. So yeah.
I have another question around that, around where those boundaries blur and how that's not accepted so much in a, suppose in a concrete example that's a slightly annoying example, in that I've had comment, if I'm having a very high pain day, I really like hanging out on Twitter because I can be in a total brain fog and be on Twitter and just essentially screaming into the void because I'm just in a lot of pain. But there have been a number of people lately have said, how come you can be on Twitter and you're not in your inbox?
Really, are they asking you by email or?
Yeah, so they're either asking me by email or they've mentioned it in meetings, and I'm wondering how I set boundaries around that so that that is clear. But also I have questions around how we all bring that level of nuance into the space, where there's not just the assumption that because someone is doing one thing, they're then available, and choosing not to do the other thing. And I think it's really fertile ground for conversation. I don't know if I have an answer for that, but do you have any ways of setting those boundaries for yourself or articulating them to other people?
Well, I'm currently personally terrified of Twitter, so I'm not really on it that much at the moment. But I try not to read too much into people's behavior in kind of comparison to my own, I guess. To kind of overanalyze that kind of thing. Although I saw, some people get upset when promoters do it, when promoters are on social media. I see artists kind of get upset about promoters being on social media, but not getting back to their emails. So it works both ways, like a little bit of understanding about free time, I guess. But we're so kind of obsessed with this right now as well. So I think our kind of thinking is kind of just heightened in that regard. We're constantly kind of overanalyzing this kind of space, like this dimension, which is personally why I've taken a bit of a step back from social media at this point, because it makes me feel a little bit more healthy personally. But since then, I've noticed that more and more promoters are kind of programming based off of Instagram. So I'm trying to do a bit of a comeback to social media in that way. Just to kind of keep the ball rolling in terms of networking.
What you said just made me think of walking to the bus stop. And actually, maybe that's connected to this notion of maybe not what happens if you stop, but how do you stop? And I think I know my body is missing walking to the bus stop with someone, so that there's like a fade down of whatever has just happened, and a bit of time to process whatever has just happened in like a physical way as well as a conversational way. So then I can stop when I'm on the bus and do something else. Whereas as soon as this closes, there's kind of nowhere to put that process in. Like I really want 10 minutes to just be like, let's chat around it and process it.
Yeah. All the time and space in between everything for kind of processing. Yeah. The process of art making for me is about research and sense making, and as I mentioned earlier, my experiences with illness or trying to kind of alleviate symptoms or process symptoms, that has directly affected my practice. And so yeah, art making is it helps me in that regard. And I also think for audiences, it can offer space for people to work through certain things.
I have loads of very tangled thoughts, which I think is quite appropriate given the question. One of them is I really appreciate, I'm an associate artist with the Scottish Mental Health Arts Festival, which is like a long-standing relationship based on the fact that I just hung about a lot and talked about the way they work a lot to the and then was like, we should call this something because it just seems like I'm a weird fan that keeps propping up. But whenever they run events and spaces, it's like 30% artists, 30% people with lived experience of mental ill health, and 30% like practitioners in the medical field, actually, and in the healing field. And maybe those percentages aren't totally accurate, but there's always that mix. And I think I find the conversations that they run really fruitful because it allows that tangle to happen. Because I think they're inextricably linked. Like culturally, I think you can research how art making and meme making has been crucial to the survival of any culture in terms of mental health. And it leads me to the question of like where industry sits in this and how sometimes we don't explicitly talk about industry being part of that tangle. Because I think there's part of me, and I have to do a bit of a shout out to the amazing Chris Devani, who we had a chat lately because I've not been feeling great. And Chris just said to me, what would it be for you to commit to dancing? Not to commit to the industry, just to commit to dancing again. And I properly wept, but in like that beautiful physical way, your body just like drops.
Yeah.
I realized that for me, the mental health healing and art making exist as a perfect tangle that is actually quite a safe place to be, that does beautiful things for me. And then it's this like thing of industry that gets in amongst it and makes it messy.
Self-promotion and the kind of competitive nature of working in this regard is really difficult, and a bit of a minefield for anyone, but particularly if you have mental health stuff going on. Yeah, and I guess I keep coming to that point, back to that point of being careful not to measure your self-worth with your art making, or to kind of try and separate that out a little bit, is kind of really important for me personally, but it's really hard to do that.
And the weave of, I think for me, the other thing is like within the art making, that's where a lot of the really important relationships in my life have been found, because you find people that you would really choose and that you're like, we have this thing in common and we can share this space without having to over articulate it. Like something, I think particularly as dancers, something makes sense. And I think sharing bodies is intimate in a completely non-sexual way, like actually in a much more profound way often. And I think for me that tangles in when industry comes into it, because there's the power to actually upset people or find that those profound relationships don't translate into collaborative relationships or all of those things. And I know that something I live with a lot is a very poor relationship to failure that can be really detrimental to my mental health. And that often comes in like social failure as well. But if I am unwell, I'm less likely to create a situation that makes others well. And then there's loads of shame. And then you just end up in this cycle of destruction whilst watching your bank balance. And I'm not sure how all of those things balance and how we recognize that there's kind of bridges between the work of it and the healing all of the time, and recognize when it's safe to cross them and when it isn't. If that makes sense, that's a really mixed metaphor, but there's something in it.
Yeah. I'm stuck now. I'm totally stuck now. I think I'm just really, I'm sitting here and I'm self-editing because of the kind of subject, and even though there is this moment right now where people are kind of opening up and being vulnerable and talking about their experiences, their kind of health experiences. It still feels so taboo in the dance world to kind of do this, you know. So yeah, I guess I'm just kind of managing this process in that way.
I really appreciate you saying that, Roberta, because I feel the exact same. I feel like if we were sitting having this conversation as a cup of tea, just the two of us, I think things would flow a lot more.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to notice that, and it maybe leads us to our final question. It's really important that everyone involved in the sector, whatever that word means, like owns that and recognizes that somehow there's a level of a complicity in that, whether we want to be complicit in it or not, without it becoming nasty and blamey. But I think there's something about recognizing that going, we should all be open and vulnerable, doesn't translate to it's okay to be open and vulnerable.
Or employment.
Yes.
Yeah, in relationship to the question of what needs to shift, I was thinking that in sports, they have sports psychology as quite a kind of prominent practice alongside athletic performance. But in dance, there is performance psychology is a kind of practice or a thing, but it's not so developed. So I think if there was more focus on psychological exploration within education settings in dance, certainly that we would kind of grow a much kind of healthier kind of culture, kind of industry out of that point. And again, like things are shifting. You can kind of get a sense of how things are shifting. There is more focus on mental health in institutions, but I think if there was more of a kind of serious kind of practice of looking at psychological exploration alongside training, I think it would bring, more groundedness kind of to kind of the industry overall.
I totally agree. I think there's something really beautiful in people being able to discuss their boundaries, and that those boundaries are like a living thing and that they shift, but people to articulate their boundaries and their needs that enables us to go, how do we work then? And maybe sometimes the answer is that we can't work, and that's okay, because we've not then tried to like squish ourselves into a space. And a part of me, this might be too radical and people might be like, don't say this, because I think it comes with loads of issues around money predominantly. But I think of some of the countries where I really admire some of their approaches, and I think of the countries that have a dark period, because I think there's something in not being able to stop collectively and really stop for a considered period of time and breathe, that means we never get to the place of recognizing how we're working and what we want to change about that. So this notion, if somehow mystically it was all possible, universal basic income, a month of the year of just going, we go dark and we rest, and recognizing that that gives people the capacity to come back. One, having done that thing that you were talking about, where they have the other things in their life that are their identity and their sense of self-worth, but also to come back and be like, as we're launching back into this isn't that pace we were at before is ridiculous. What are we doing? And I have friends who work in Norway and Sweden predominantly that really say no in that period, and it's just everything is off, and actually the benefits they talk about are huge in loads of ways. And I think the other one for me is I think we just need to acknowledge the hypocrisy that we live with. And I think of, and this is no judgment on their work, I think of the fact that Lloyd Newson or a Lloyd Newson can make work for 2 years and that is celebrated and honoured and rewarded, whereas an independent artist gets kind of 4 weeks and a bit of R&D and maybe can't take that 2 years with a level of resource or a level of support. And then those things are measured right beside each other. And I think there's something in us being able, I think it would be healthy for me anyway, to be like, we need to recognize the parameters that we're asking people to work in, and then either adjust how that is measured or recognize that those parameters don't serve everyone or the art in a really useful way. Because I think that's what, there's something about this conversation with me that can sometimes sit as if it sits alongside the art. And I'm just like, for me, it's actually about making better work. The more all of these conditions are met, the better work we'll make. And that's just better for everyone.
Yeah, and more interesting work.
Yeah, whatever better means. That's not me claiming to have any quality scale to measure work on. I don't even know what I mean by that. And room to make really bad work. I think I'd like to work in an industry where you can make something and it fails, and that feels like part of the process, more like a scientist than the end of your career and your reputation and all of those things that lead to that panic. So in short, I'd like to make bad work. I'd like to have a long time to make terrible work. I think that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think I've done that. I think I've made a lot of terrible work. Yeah, but I think it's a useful process to go through.
Thank you for sharing this space.
Thank you.